departments can use.
This morning a coalition of leading health bodies, with the support of the Children's Commissioner, launched a report in the River Room aimed at improving children's nutritional health. Like the Quorum Charter, it calls for the extension of free school meals, starting with all primary school children and also auto-enrolment. Will the government finally listen to and act on the growing calls for the extension of free school meals, which the evidence shows will improve children's health and educational performance?
To remind the noble lady that this government has extended school meal eligibility more than any other, including through universal infant free school meals and for families with no recourse to public funds. Our strategy has been to support families in a very major way, with £104 billion of support going in between 2022 and 25, giving parents, rightly, the discretion on the use of those funds.
So, my Lords, the noble lady, the Minister, well understands that in recent years there has been a steady rundown on family support services, and this has been at a considerable cost to some children who would normally have been able to depend upon this kind of help and support at a critical stage in their lives. And sad to say, the children who come from the poorest homes who are affected in this way are also likely to be persistent absentee people from schools, thereby really limiting their development. Could the noble lady say whether or not there are going to be opportunities in the future to increase family support services?
I suppose I would just slightly reframe the noble lord's first assertion. I think there's been a redirection of resources to increasingly complex cases in child protection. So there's been a displacement of resources from some of the earlier help services, but the House is aware of the government's commitment to rolling out family hubs and providing really comprehensive, targeted support at families who need it most. I share the noble lord's deep concerns about attendance, and I can say that all of us as ministers across the department have this as a primary focus.
My Lords, the Quorum Charter.
Charter for Children makes disturbing reading. 4.2 million children in this country are in poverty. 4.2 million children in a wealthy country. And this figure is rising. The Minister will agree that this has a devastating consequences on children's health, security and opportunities. So can the Minister tell the House what action they plan to take to stop the cuts in children's services?
Well, we understand that local authorities are under significant financial pressure, and that's why we've committed to major reform in relation to children's social care, focusing increasingly on earlier intervention. But over the last 3 spending reviews, local government has seen real increases in their core spending power, with a major cash injection of £5.1 billion last year, of which £3.1 billion was provided through a central government grant.
My Lords, the Quorum Charter calls for the reform of childcare, enabling all children to have access to high-quality early years provision. So I very much welcome the announcement last year of free provision for 2-year-olds as from April the 1st, with further extension later on. But in the year that's just ended, there were 216 nursery closures in England, compared with 144 in the previous year. So what steps is the government taking to encourage early years providers to increase capacity to meet this new demand?
Well, I thank my noble friend for his question, and of course he's right about the number of closures, but overall the workforce has increased by 4% in the last year. But my noble friend asks about action now, where we've announced an increase in the hourly rates paid to providers to £5.88 for 3 to 4-year-olds and up to £11.22 for the under twos. We're allowing parents to register their interest early in the new free childcare provision, allowing nurseries to expand, and we've increased the flexibility for childminders to deliver their services outside their home.
Improving children's lives should centre on ensuring we deliver high standards for all children in all schools. According to an IFS report released last month, schools serving more disadvantaged pupils have seen larger spending cuts since 2010. How does the government justify this gap in pupil spending?
I don't fully recognise the figures that the noble lady refers to. We have been adjusting school funding, trying to move, as the noble lady knows, towards a national funding formula, and we've also invested increasingly in pupil premium to support just the children that the noble lady and the government are most concerned about.
Thank you. My Lords, looking to the other end of children, that is to say the teenagers, would the government do something better about youth clubs, which might have some effect on gangs?
Multiple things that will have effects on gangs, but clearly engagement of young people, as the noble lady suggests, is very important, and that's why we made the youth commitment and guarantee last year.
While I acknowledge the noble lady, the minister's personal commitment to support children's services and children themselves, that is not necessarily the outcome for her ministers and the government department. As stated by all across the House, will noble lord lady, the minister, look at the Tar Hamlet practice, which has been providing not only educational support, but also free meals from age 3 to all the way to senior schools. Will she undertake to at least explore why one authority can make it and others aren't able to?
Well, I think the department is happy, of course, to look not just at the ability to provide meals in the way that the noble lady sets out, but also to see the impact of that. But a core principle of this government is to give as much autonomy as possible to schools. They know their children, they know how to use their budgets, and we trust them and back their judgment.
My Lord, I declare an interest as the patron of Conran, the Quorum, the country's first and longest-serving children's charity. Our Charter for Children makes several important recommendations, from early years education to school leavers and mental health, which should not be ignored because of financial constraints, as they will benefit society long-term. We need to show every child across the nation is valued and that no child is left behind, because, as I always say, childhood lasts a lifetime. So will the Minister agree to meet with me and representatives from Conran to discuss this actually important report?
Of course, I'd be delighted to meet with the noble lady and the team from Quorum, and I'd just like to put on record our thanks to them for all of the work they do.
Second oral question, Lord Moylan.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the Government is grateful to the UN Special Rapporteur's interest in this important matter and has considered her letter carefully. A response was sent on the 19th of December 2023 and is published on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights website at ochchr.org. The IPP Action Plan aims to promote sentence progression for all serving IPP sentences, and provisions in the Victims and Prisoners Bill will, over time, reduce the number subject to that sentence.
My Lords, I thank my noble and learned friend, and I apologise that my question was tabled quite by coincidence on the day that the government actually issued its response to this letter. But may I ask him, does he accept the evidence submitted to the Justice Select Committee and the other place, and referred to by the Special Rapporteur, that the mental health problems caused by the IPP sentence itself multiply the difficulties that these prisoners face in obtaining release, and that therefore the government would be wholly justified in considering any legislation in treating them as a special case with particular needs and trying to assist them to obtain the discharge of the sentence.
Lords, the government would accept that there are certain special mental health issues in relation to a number of these prisoners. Those are being tackled as far as we can within the existing system, and the action plan to which I've just referred contains provisions in that regard, particularly in relation to improved psychological services and better support for prisoners on licence so as to avoid later recall. I would not accept the second part of the question, that it follows that we need special legislation to deal with this.
To the noble Lord Moylan for his continued campaigning on this issue, and we're grateful to the government for responding at such length to the rapporteur. If everything in the garden, the IPP garden, is so rosy in relation to indeterminately detained people, some of whom would have only got a sentence of months for their actual crime. If everything's so rosy, why did the government abolish this sentence in the first place? And why did Lord Clarke, as late as 2016, call the threshold that prisoners have to meet to secure their release both ridiculous and absurd?
I wouldn't accept that and I do not assert that everything in the garden is rosy. This area is one of the acute dilemmas, perhaps the most acute dilemma, faced by the Ministry of Justice. Your Lordships will be aware that IPP prisoners are being addressed in Part 4 of the Victims and Prisoners Bill currently before Parliament, which we will shortly discuss in detail in committee, and I am meeting noble lords on Thursday to take that discussion further.
Has the time not come to enact a presumption? I'm so sorry, Kenneth, you're getting in. Forgive me.
Sorry, Rick. My Lords, this isn't just a major problem in the system, it's a major disgrace to the British justice system that these thousands of people are being kept in this way. When I persuaded my then Cabinet colleagues to abolish the IPP system because it was working so badly, unfortunately, I wasn't able to persuade them to change the application of the licensing system in the ordinary way to these prisoners. I'm glad the government's now contemplating action. I look forward to the legislation, but it's taken years. And will they consider something drastic, such as when prisoners are released on licence, the licence period should be for a much shorter period than usual, because at the moment people are being returned for quite minor breaches of licence to the disproportionate consequence of an indeterminate sentence that may keep them in prison for life. Why can't they be released on licence for 12 months and thereafter be subject to the usual criminal law for the protection of the public? Will the Minister consider that and every other suggestion that's flowing into him from the campaigners?
Well, Lords, you're aware that the Victims and Prisoners Bill reduces the qualifying licence period from 10 years to 3 years, with a presumption of termination at that point, and automatic termination 2 years thereafter if there is no recall in the meantime. A recent report by His Majesty's Inspector of Probation found that there were no cases where recall was inappropriate. None of the cases examined found that the recall was inappropriate, but that in some cases, further additional support in the community might have avoided the need for recall. And that has led to a number of recommendations, all of which the government has accepted.
Served on the Justice Committee my Lords, when I served on the Justice Committee in the Scottish Parliament in 2005, I recall that Scotland chose a different path than England and Wales when it was introduced by the Labour government in 2005. And it was right that they were abolished in 2012. But the UN Rapporteur's figures make very sober reading when it stated that for those 97% of those who are still imprisoned are now 2 years beyond the tariff, and 46% are 10 years beyond the tariff, where rehabilitation was designed to be an integral part of the sentencing. So what are the obstacles from the government for implementing the Justice Committee in the Commons' recommendation endorsed by the UN Rapporteur for a resentencing exercise and rehabilitation now being put forward? What are the obstacles to this exercise happening so we can finally put to bed what has been a very sorry exercise?
Lords, I think I have explained this matter several times before to your Lordships, but in brief, the situation is this. We have 1,200 prisoners who have never been released. Almost all of those have come several times before the parole board, who each time has decided they are not safe to release. Any resentencing exercise would inevitably either aim at or result in possibly 1,000 persons being released who are not safe to release. The cohort includes many violent and sexual offenders who are particularly difficult to manage in the community. The government feels it cannot take that risk, and it should not raise expectations. It should manage the situation by preparing the remaining prisoners for safe release.
My Lords, when IPP sentences were in place, the offender received a minimum tariff. And when the offender went to prison, an offender manager, who is a probation officer, wrote a sentence plan. And that same probation officer would also review that plan. Can the Minister say with confidence that all the elements of the sentence plans which are currently in place can be completed and can be completed in a reasonable time?
Lords, it's a very good question, if I may say so to your Lordships, and a strengthened action plan, a strengthened sentence plan for each prisoner, each IPP prisoner, is an essential part of the wider IPP action plan. That is currently being worked on at the moment so that each IPP prisoner still in custody will have a personalised, updated and hopefully effective sentence plan with the aim of eventually leading to their release if that is at all possible. I should say that the newly established IPP Progression Board, which is dealing with this matter, now includes stakeholder representatives who met in September last, met again just before Christmas, and will meet again in March when we will report a full update on how the action plan is progressing.
My Lords, may I reinforce the suggestion? I think it's this side, in fact. May I reinforce the suggestion made by my noble friend Lord Clark? Has the time not come to provide a presumption that all IPP prisoners who have served the tariff should be released unless there is robust evidence tendered to the parole board that they are unsafe to be released?
Well, Lords, I think that is in effect the present position. The government has no interest in holding these prisoners, especially given the pressure on the prison system generally. The government's fear, worry and concern is public protection for the reasons that I've given.
My Lords, Special Rapporteur Dr Alice Edwards, who I had the pleasure and the privilege to meet last month with the Justice Union's parliamentary group, stated forcefully, and I would like to quote this please, "The UK, as a society with a strong rule of law tradition, has measures in place to protect the community after individuals are released." So why therefore does the noble Lord the Minister think these measures will be ineffective in the case of IPP prisoners?
The government replied in detail to the learned special rapporteur over 13 pages in our letter of the 23rd of December, to which I refer your Lordships, and I look forward to further debate and discussion on this matter when we're dealing with the Victims and Prisoners Bill.
Baroness Boycott. I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, I declare my interest as set out in the register. The government is clear that the current volume of sewage being discharged into our waters is unacceptable. Our plan for water is addressing this and delivering more investment, stronger regulation and tougher enforcement to clean up our water and water environment. Where there is evidence of wrongdoing, the Environment Agency will not hesitate to act.
Noble Lord to the Dispatch Box, and I too declare my interest. The Panorama programme threw up a lot of issues. It's not quite Mr. Bates' takes on the post office, although I wish it had had that effect, because there's just as much, or there is a lot of cover-up, I think, going on at the moment in terms of the sewage works in this country. One point I'd like to raise, and I think others will be raised as the questions go on. Campaigners and journalists have been using freedom of information or environmental information requests to water companies to try to explore and expose the illegal sewage discharges, but increasingly they are refusing to comply. In fact, 9 out of 11 water and sewage companies in England and Wales have said that the ongoing Ofwat and Environmental Agency investigations means they don't have to hand over any data. Now, this is completely contrary to what David Black, the CEO of Ofwat, has told the Public Accounts Committee just 4 weeks ago. He says this isn't a good enough reason. So does the government not agree that this data should be provided for the sake of transparency, for public health and protection of the environment? Rivers and our waters is something that everyone in this country cares about.
I thank the Noble Baroness for her question, and just addressing the issue of collusion first, the government does not believe that there is any collusion. The role of the Environment Agency as the environmental regulator for water companies is to provide guidance to help water companies with their water resource management, ensure they're complying with the regulations. And just moving on to the issue of FOIs and environmental information regulations, water companies are only subject to the Environmental Information Regulations 204 and not the Freedom of Information Act of 2000. For the purposes of the Environmental Information Regulations, water companies are their own legal entity, which means that it is for the organisation to tell you why they cannot provide you or with all or some of the information requested.
My Lords, may I welcome my noble friend to this House and congratulate him on his new appointment. Will he join with me in looking at possibly the best way of preventing sewage entering the watercourses is to ensure that the end of the automatic right to connect major new developments in inadequate, inappropriate piping? Would he look into when the consultation will be brought forward to implement Schedule 3 of the 2010 Water Management Act to ensure just that there will be no automatic connections in these circumstances and a better use of SUDs and natural flood defences?
I thank my noble friend for her kind words. They are greatly appreciated. We will be implementing the Schedule 3 of the 2010 Water Management Act as previously announced, and I hope that addresses her question.
The Minister to his first outing at the dispatch box. My Lords, it is clear from whistleblower evidence in the recent BBC Panorama investigation into water pollution that water companies can and do cheat the operator self-monitoring tests by manipulating flows at failing sewage works. This ensures that there is no flow to sample when the official tester arrives. Will the government concede that trusting companies who are financially motivated to cover up failing works to avoid penalties from Ofwat to carry out their own testing is not an effective regulatory system? And will the government commit to putting robust, independent regulation in place to ensure sewage works compliance?
Water companies, including United Utilities, have always been required to report pollution incidents and breaches of their permits to the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency also monitor and inspect water company sites independently. The Environment Agency has significantly driven up monitoring and transparency from water companies in recent years. As any reports of misreporting are a concern, and if there is evidence, the Environment Agency will always take action including pursuing and prosecuting companies that are deliberately obstructive.
My Lords, could I also welcome the Noble Lord to his place and say how much I look forward to working with him in the coming months. But in a written answer, the Noble Lord noted that following pollution from United Utilities in the Windermere area, the Environment Agency recognised that it should have done better and referred itself for independent review by its Scottish partner. The answer also stated that learning has been shared with the EA to inform future responses. So can I ask the Minister how many similar regulatory failures have taken place over the last 3 years and how the Department ensures that transparency will be there about the outcomes?
Again, I thank the Noble Baroness for her kind words. The Environment Agency has fully reviewed the evidence about this incident and have concluded that the most likely cause, this is on the Cunsey-Beck issue at Lake Windermere, was caused by algal bloom. However, since the Environment Agency did not identify a definitive source of this serious problem, it did ask the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, as the Noble Baroness stated, to review its response. As a result of this review, the Environment Agency has made improvements to water quality monitoring in the area, including installing sensors that monitor river quality in real time. We have no plans to reopen the investigation in the absence of any substantial new evidence.
My Lord, senior members. And the new minister, by the way. Oh, sorry.
Senior members of staff from water companies appearing in front of the regulatory committee told us that the monitoring they have put in place is available freely in real time to the public. They appear to be now claiming under kind of quasi-sub judice, because they're under investigation, that they're not prepared to provide that information. Is that something the government is going to let them get away with?
The government's very clear that we will be providing real-time information available, and it will be available publicly. So if any of the water companies feel that they're not going to be doing that, they will have the Environment Agency chasing them, I can assure you.
My Lords. Issue. I do welcome the new minister, by the way, but on this issue he has stepped into a large bucket of doo-doo. I'm just warning him. We are very unhappy here about this issue. Now, I didn't see the BBC Panorama programme that's been referred to, but they said, or they showed, that United Utilities is due to receive millions of pounds in performance payments from bill payers as a result of covering up and wrongly categorising pollution incidents. Now, is the government going to research and look into this fraud? Because it sounds as if the allegations were that the Environment Agency is also complicit, and it could be that other water companies are doing exactly the same.
When I watched the Panorama programme, I too was left with a distinct impression that there was something fishy going on here. But it's standard practice for the initial and final categorizations to be different. This is because the initial categorization is based on the information provided in initial report. An Environment Agency officer will then gather evidence about the incident from a variety of sources, including attendance at the most significant pollution events. They will then assess this information and give a final categorization that is based on the evidence rather than on the initial estimate.
My Lords, we made no progress on health and safety until we made the directors of the companies personally responsible. It's no good relying on a system of fines, because that just ends up putting up the bills of the consumers. Now that he's in this new position, would my noble friend look at the prospects of holding boards to account for their performance in this regard? That will change the whole nature of their attitudes. And as to the point about something fishy going on, the point of all of this is all the fish are dying.
As the former chair of the Atlantic Salmon Trust, I have some sympathy with the Noble Lord's view. The government has legislated to introduce unlimited penalties on water companies, and I appreciate the point that you're making, but it's a start in the right direction. And there's a much wider range of issues that can be applied now to water companies by the Environment Agency to hold them to account. And the government, as I stated at the very beginning, is acutely aware that this is not a satisfactory position and is looking into the matter with all seriousness.
Question, Lord Bishop of St Albans.
Leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
The NHS has made progress against its targets, especially given the challenges in recovering from COVID-19, changing demography and winter pressures. Of course, the government recognises that there's still a way to go and is working non-stop to support the NHS to do better. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank all NHS staff for their hard work to improve performance this winter.
My Lords, I'd like to join with thanking NHS staff who are doing a fantastic job, but there are some structural problems here. And in particular, I'm concerned about ambulance response times, which are causing a great deal of concern. Despite the fact that I think the government has increased the level 2 calls from 18-minute response to 30-minute response. My Lords, category 2 calls deal with such life-threatening events as strokes and heart attacks. And this is deeply worrying. What is His Majesty's Government doing to reduce the response time? And will the government consider returning to the 18-minute response time for category 2 calls?
Agree with the basic point, as I'm sure all noble lords will, in terms of course, the ambulance is the front line and probably most important service in all of this. That's why we have invested in 800 new ambulances with 200 million of funding, and it's early days, but it is starting to take effect. So the category 2 instance referred to, we've managed to halve the time it takes since last year. Still too long, but halve the time, but absolutely we need to make more progress in this area as well.
Would the Minister agree with me that if you really want to hit the targets of the NHS, then what you have to do is reduce the fact that 50% of people who present themselves at the NHS are suffering from food poverty? So actually, why don't we concentrate on lifting the great weight on the NHS by doing serious work around getting rid of poverty?
I agree with the noble lord that prevention is key in all of this. In fact, about half the number of people who turn up to A&E don't need to go to A&E, and they could be seen in other settings. So I completely agree that all the elements in terms of prevention and getting ahead of the problem, including if there are issues around food, are key to this.
Question from the Right Reverend Prelate and his reference to stroke patients. Given that there is a 3-hour window for stroke patients during which, if certain treatments are given, the outcome is so much better, what has the government done to ensure that adding on the ambulance time to the time then when the patient arrives at hospital, that more patients are being treated within that 3-hour window? Is there some sort of target that is specifically for stroke patients? It makes such a difference.
My noble friend is absolutely correct on that, and strokes have been a major focus. I'm glad to say actually that was one of the first areas where we rolled out AI everywhere, with the result being that actually we were able to, and I'll get the precise figures to my noble friend, but we were actually able to improve treatment time so much and the time to do it that actually the recovery rate has increased by 2/3 as a result of it. So it's absolutely right that it's an area which is top focus.
Government does keep telling us, and I understand why, I congratulate them on it, that the numbers of people employed as doctors and nurses have risen in the recent years. Can he therefore explain why productivity over the same time has reduced by 4%?
The noble lady is correct. Staff numbers have gone up, but for a number of reasons that we're exploring, output has not gone up by the same amount, and it is a key thing. I think that all noble lords would agree that making sure we're getting a value for money out of the service is key to all of this. We are actually engaged in a key productivity study right now to answer the reasons.
Back in 2013, the government set a target for the NHS to become paperless by 2018, later extending this to 2020 when it seemed too ambitious. Now, this may come as something of a surprise to the millions of people who continue to have regular paper-based interactions with the NHS. Could the Noble Lord the Minister tell the House when he now expects that target for the NHS to become fully digital to be met, and would he agree that it's now even more important that we achieve it than when it was first set over a decade ago?
I definitely agree it's more important, and that's why I'm pleased that we have made such progress. If you look at one area in terms of the hospital records being available and doctors' records to patients, it's gone up from the beginning of the year about 1% of GPs to about 90% today. At the same time, about 90% of all our hospital records are now digitised. That compares to less than 3%. It's less than 3% in Germany. So we made massive progress, and it is key to all the reform and actually improving productivity across the NHS as well.
The Noble Lord well knows that we have raised the question of primary care again and again in this chamber, and I wonder whether he'd be kind enough to tell the House how the government feels it's doing with regard to the retention of very highly qualified general practitioners at the height of their career, who are currently leaving early. Up to about 50% are considering retirement before the retirement age. Would he be kind enough to comment on how he feels that's going?
Yeah, very good. Well, staff retention, particularly in the area of GPs, is vital. That's why we try to listen to the number one reason why they were retiring, in terms of feeling that their pensions were being adversely affected, and that's why we changed the rules in the last budget to try and address that. It's early days, but I hear that that is starting to make progress. But absolutely key is making sure that primary care, it's the front line. That's why I'm pleased that we've actually increased the number of appointments by 50 million, more than 50 million, ahead of our manifesto target from it all. But absolutely it needs to be a key focus.
My Lords, I draw attention to my registered interests. The long-term, indeed the short and medium-term sustainability of the NHS is critically dependent upon an active engagement in research and the adoption of innovation at scale and pace. Is the Noble Lord the Minister content that His Majesty's Government are doing enough to ensure that the NHS is resourced to support that research and innovation agenda?
It is key, and I think we were all aware that a couple of years ago, and this was the result of Lord Shaughnessy's report, that we weren't doing as well as we needed to be in the clinical trials area. I'm glad to say that since then, actually, there have been a lot of progress towards it, and so we are now hitting the similar amounts to our comparator nations. But absolutely, innovation is at the key of everything we've done. We've got some very good examples of it. I mentioned the stroke AI treatment earlier. We've just set a similar thing in terms of AI for looking at chest cancers, but absolutely it's something that we need to make sure we continue to progress.
My Lords, the King's Fund has highlighted a delay to the release of additional funding to help NHS and social care services prepare for winter, which will of course only worsen the situation of missed targets and wait times for patients. So can the Noble Lord the Minister tell the House what the reasons are for this delay and what steps are being taken to unblock the money to get it to where it's needed?
Well, one of the key learnings, I think, from last year, and goes back to the whole question about planning, was actually if you put social care monies in too late, then you don't get nearly as effective spend. So that's why actually we brought forward the 600 million discharge fund to much earlier, actually into the summer, so that local authorities and care providers could plan on that money. It is starting to make a difference. A key thing that Noble Lords have heard me talk about is bed blocking. And actually, we've seen a 10% reduction in bed blocking since these measures have come into effect in the last few weeks. Early days, but we are actually making progress.
My Lords, the number of over 85s is due to double over the next 30 years. Would my noble friend, the Minister, give some consideration to government funding for extra care facilities and at-home treatment such as physiotherapy in order that pressure be taken off acute district hospital beds in respect of older people.
Funny enough, I had this conversation in terms of productivity just today, and that's what the virtual wards, the 11,000 extra beds that we put in, is actually making a real impact on that, because of course it's much better that people can be treated in their own home knowing they've got the comfort of these virtual displays and virtual treatment to look after them. We've got 11,000 extra ones, 72% utilisation, and yes, it's really working.
My Lords, the noble Lord keeps talking about progress being made, but if he looks at, say, the 4-hour A&E target, he knows the latest figures showed that they only reached 69% in December. In 2010, my Lords, his party inherited a 98.3% performance. What does he think it says about his party's stewardship of the NHS?
Yeah. Well, I can talk about what we're doing now, which is showing real progress, and I have to say, the saying, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, comes to mind, because looking at those same targets, I noticed the last time Labour-run NHS Wales reached that, the 4-hour A&E target never reached. Never reached. The last time it hit the 62-day cancer target, August 2010. 14 years ago. The last time it hit the hospital treatment, August 2010. So perhaps I say politely, you might want to get your own house in order first.
Fourth oral question, the Lord Bishop of St Albans.
I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lord, since 2017, we've provided over £373 million funding for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and over £30 million for Rohingya and other Muslim minorities in Myanmar. In December, the Global Refugee Forum, we announced an additional £7 million for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh and for the Myanmar humanitarian crisis. We also reiterated our commitment to finding a long-term solution to the crisis, including the safe, voluntary and dignified return of the Rohingya to Myanmar when conditions there allow.
I'm grateful for all that His Majesty's Government has been doing to support this terrible humanitarian crisis. But UK aid to the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh has actually declined by about 82% since 2019-2020. In the past year, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh have suffered flooding, cyclones, fires, cuts in food rations simply because of reductions in aid. Just 2 weeks ago, 800 dwellings were destroyed in Cox's Bazar by a fire. In the light of this terrible humanitarian crisis that we're observing, what other resources can His Majesty's Government offer to try and address this dreadful problem?
Right Reverend Prelate is entirely right about the scale of this crisis. There are 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Think of the scale of that in terms of people living often in IDP camps and in other temporary accommodation. What I would say to him, of course I wouldn't deny for a moment that the scale of funding has gone down, and that's the same with many aid programs because of the move from 0.7 to 0.5%, but crucially also the diversion of a lot of aid money to support refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan, which I think was entirely a right thing to do. I can tell him that we'll be spending another 20 million next year, but to put it in context, I would make the point that Britain's contribution is almost twice as much as the EU's over the last 7 years. We are playing our role in making sure that this isn't the forgotten crisis.
I declare an interest as a trustee of the Burma Campaign UK. All leaders of the Rohingya community associations have led calls for the British government, as the penholder on Burma at the UN, to take action. If the British government is not going to convene a meeting of the UN Security Council to address the failing of the Burmese military to take measures as instructed by the ICJ to prevent further ongoing genocide against the Rohingya, what action is the government taking to ensure a level of protection for the Rohingya remaining in Myanmar.
The noble lady is entirely right. We are the penholder, and we take that duty very seriously, and we've taken a range of action on this. I would say that fundamentally what we're doing is making sure the aid is going in, and I've just said what our contribution is. Second, we're making sure there is a proper authorities put in place to stop gender-based violence and to collect evidence from the camps and to make sure that people are held accountable. The third part of the strategy must be to put pressure on the government to recognise that this country needs to have proper provision for all its ethnic minorities and parts and make sure there is effectively a peace process and a more inclusive set of arrangements for the country so that everyone can feel they have a part in its future. Ultimately, no one wants the Rohingya to have to stay in Bangladesh. They should be able to go home.
My Lords, the Foreign Secretary's response to the Right Reverend Prelate indicated that funds had been diverted to the European Resettlement Scheme away from other schemes. Now, I have asked time and time again in this chamber whether or not funds to support the Ukraine resettlement scheme in the UK have been diverted from other areas. And ministers have denied that, so can he clarify that point on the record? And secondly, the UK has been a refuge for many Rohingya who have sought asylum in the UK under the Gateway Protection Scheme. This was closed in 2020, and the report on safe and legal routes by the Home Office on Friday have now said that there are no safe and legal routes that the Rohingyas would be able to apply to. So if any Rohingya is seeking refuge in the UK through a proper asylum application but are undocumented, can he reassure me, please, that they will not be detained and sent to Rwanda under his new scheme?
Well, first of all, what I'd say, let me clarify the point I made. If you look at the ODA budget, obviously it does qualify to pay for refugees from Ukraine and Afghanistan and elsewhere. So what happened to the budget effectively over previous years was not only was it moved from 0.7 to 0.5, but also some of the budget was taken up by ODA spending, quite rightly, on looking after people from Ukraine and from Afghanistan. But you can now see that the overseas aid budget being spent overseas is actually increasing. For instance, when it comes to Africa next year, the budget will be almost doubling to well over $1 billion. In terms of what we want to see with the Rohingya, as I said, is clearly there's a huge refugee crisis. They're being looked after in Bangladesh. Ideally, when circumstances are right, they'll be able to go home. In between now and then, I think we should learn the lesson of the Syrian refugee crisis, where we did a lot to help countries like Lebanon and particularly Jordan to make sure that people were able to stay there, able to work there, able to build some livelihoods there, and then when it's possible to go home.
Well, my Lords, looking specifically at the point the Right Reverend Prelate raised about the plight of the refugees in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, will he look again at what happened only last week when 5,000 of those refugees were displaced from the shacks and the tents in which they've been living as a result of the fire? But he invited us to look at the longer term. Can I reinforce what Baroness Nye said about the International Court of Justice, which has imposed interim provisional measures on the Burmese military with the support of the British government, which was extremely welcome? Will he raise at the Security Council the failure to implement that? And will he have discussions with the National Unity Government about the long-term rights of the Rohingya, the Kachin, the Karen and the other ethnic and religious minorities? Because that is the fundamental issue. If someone is not an equal citizen in a place like the new Burma that will emerge after the coup, nothing will change.
Well, fundamentally, the Noble Lord is completely right about the interim measures which have been set out by the International Court of Justice, and it's incumbent on the government of Myanmar to make sure those are put in place and to abide by them. But the general point he makes, which is that what's required is an inclusive federal state where every ethnicity, every nationality can feel it has a part to play in the country, it will benefit from the country's resources. That is what is required. Now, obviously, we have this military government with whom we have very limited contact with, but for the long-term future of Myanmar, that is the only answer.
I think you understand the House doesn't find his answers completely satisfactory. He has said that it's up to the responsibility of the government of Myanmar. He knows that action isn't being taken. The range of actions he's outlined seem to be around data collection and putting pressure on the government. As the penholder in the Security Council on this issue, there is a special responsibility on the British government. Is he able to say what discussions he has had with other members of the Security Council about putting pressure on the government? Because otherwise nobody is going to be held to account for the crisis that has emerged.
Noble lady is absolutely right. We do take our responsibilities very seriously, and we do have those discussions at permanent members level at the UN Security Council, and I will personally take this up with Barbara Woodward, our excellent permanent representative, and see what more can be done over the coming period. But fundamentally, we've set out what we think is necessary, the aid to go in, the accountability to be in place, and the pressure for a long-term solution. And at the same time, the government obeying the interim measures set out by the ICJ.
My Lords, the failure of the international community to deal with the attempted genocide in Myanmar against the Rohingya is just one example of the failure of the responsibility to protect norms over the course of the last decade in so many places. What is the government doing to reinvigorate the discussion on responsibility to protect at the United Nations and ensure that there is a refreshed approach to this in place that will help protect those citizens that are under attack from their own government, legitimate or otherwise?
Well, the issue of the responsibility to protect is one that we have taken forward and we do discuss with allies and partners, and it's a developing doctrine, as it were. What I would say to Noble Lords, when it comes to this issue, we do have a role. We are making a contribution. We're doing, I think, more than many countries of our size and scale. But I do think that there's a lot that we should do to support ASEAN. After all, they've set out their 5 principles for dealing with Myanmar, which we support. They have their coordinator, who we want to work with from Laos. And I think that ultimately, we should respect the fact that in their region, ASEAN should take the lead on this issue, and we can support where we can.
My Lords, on or about the 28th of December, it was widely reported that Indonesia had pushed back a boat containing a significant number of Rohingya refugees out of their territorial waters. And I've not been able to find any report about what's happened since the people on that boat. Would the Noble Lord agree with me that that is absolutely unacceptable behaviour, out of line with international law? Has the government made or will it make any representations on this to Indonesia? And do we not have to make sure that refugees are safe?
I'm not aware of that report, and I'll certainly go away and look into it. I think what we would say is that Bangladesh should be praised for the role that it's playing in terms of taking quite so many refugees. Obviously, there's huge amounts of pressures on them. There's worries about the conditions in the camp, whether there's enough food in the camps, but ultimately they are looking after 1 million people, and that's why we're supporting them to the extent they are. And every country should take its responsibilities towards refugees very seriously.
My Lords, that concludes oral questions for today. Sorry?
My Lords, if it helps, my noble friend is unwell, so with her permission on her behalf, I beg to leave the question standing in her name on the order paper.
My Lords, we support a ceasefire, but this must be a sustainable ceasefire that will last and prevent another generation from living under the constant threat of war. That must mean that Hamas is no longer empowering Gaza, able to threaten Israel with rocket attacks and other forms of terrorism. Ahead of a permanent ceasefire, we want to see immediate and sustained humanitarian pauses to allow hostages to leave and more aid to enter Gaza, helping to create the conditions for a durable peace. As I said at the weekend, we would like to see such a pause start right now.
My Lords, I thank the Foreign Secretary for his reply, and I agree with most of it, but these benches for a number of weeks now have called for immediate bilateral ceasefire beyond a truce, which will allow hostages to be returned and bombing stopped, and of course the vital life-saving aid to be secured. Why has the government failed so far to persuade the Israeli government to allow much greater access of humanitarian aid, which is needed? There is 1.9 million displaced people, many who are now facing famine. And we now know that when it comes to civilian casualties, this is the most deadly conflict in the 21st century. The UK will need to increase its support of humanitarian assistance, but it had cut that from £107 million to £12 million between 2019 and 2023. I support the increase in aid, but surely there'll need to be an increase of the cap of 0.5 if we are going to do our bit and ensure that aid is increased.
Well, first of all, what I'd say to the noble lord is that we have trebled the amount of aid that we're putting into Gaza, and I would take on very much what he says about the pressure we need to put on, not just the Israeli government, but other governments in the region, to get more aid in. Right now, as we speak, 9 out of 10 people in Gaza are living on less than 1 meal a day. It is that serious. That's why I've had repeated conversations with the Israelis and set out a whole series of bottlenecks that need to be relieved. We need Kerem Shalom open all of the time. We need the Nitzana checkpoint to be opened all of the time. I'd like to see the port of Ashdod opened in Israel so that aid can get in to the country through maritime routes and more swiftly into Gaza. And crucially, we won't see more aid get to the people who need it unless the United Nations inside Gaza have the vehicles, have the people, and have the fuel to get it around. So those permissions need to be given. I've had these conversations both recently this morning with the new UN aid coordinator, who I'm confident will do an excellent job, and we will keep up the pressure for this. But as I say, an immediate pause to help get that aid in and help get hostages out, I think, is really essential.
My Lords, in seeking to address the crisis,
would the Foreign Secretary consider very seriously creating a UN protection force for humanitarian relief? That was done very successfully in the winter of 1992 in a very difficult situation with no ceasefire in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I recommend that approach. Although a ceasefire is absolutely essential, it is not in the immediate future very likely, but the humanitarian crisis is getting worse and worse every day, and they cannot do this without some form of protection from UN forces.
Well, as a former Foreign Secretary, I take what the noble lord says extremely seriously. I think what would make a difference is if Israel recognised its responsibilities for making sure that food and medicine and supplies have to be delivered to people in Gaza, and if it recognised that you need the UN staff who have the visas, the equipment and the fuel to help get it round. I'll certainly take away the suggestion that he makes, but the calculation here is quite simple. Before the conflict, there was something like 500 trucks going into Gaza every day. I checked the figures every single day. We're up to about 150 trucks at the moment, and that's not enough. And the longer that goes on, the greater their risk of people going hungry, the greater the risk of disease, and this humanitarian crisis getting worse. A pause would help, because there's no doubt it'll be easier to get food aid in, to get other forms of aid in, and also it would be very good to make some progress on the hostages, families of whom I was meeting with this morning.
My Lords,
I've fallen over here. The Foreign Secretary makes, I think, a really sort of alarming point that within Gaza, there are 9 out of 10 Palestinians not even getting a single meal every day. Now, the need for a sustained ceasefire is absolutely clear as a first step towards getting humanitarian aid in. But can he say something? Because the government confirmed last week that currently there are no plans for RAF aid flights or Royal Naval deliveries being planned. Now, can he say why? Because surely that would be a good way of getting aid in, trying to get around some of the problems we've got at the moment.
What I say to the noble lady is we are looking at every single way of getting aid in. And of course, there are maritime options, and we had a ship leaving Cyprus and taking aid to Port Said in Egypt. The so-called over-the-beach options of trying to land aid in Gaza over the beach is extremely difficult for reasons of operational security and other forms of security. And of course, the issue of dropping aid by air. The French and Jordanians did so recently, but it was really less aid than you get into one truck. The truth of this is the best way to get aid into Gaza is through trucks. And as I said, 500 are needed, 150 are happening, and if you opened up Kerem Shalom 7 days a week, if you had the Nitzana checking point open 24/7, if you had the people inside Gaza, if you took those steps, there's plenty of aid. There's no shortage of aid. There's no shortage of countries prepared to make the financial commitment. In the end, trucks is faster, and it's trucks that we need.
My lords, women and children, my lords, thank you. My lords, women and children are always disproportionately affected by conflict. The UK considers itself a global leader on the women, peace and security agenda and holds the pen for this at the UN Security Council. Why are we not hearing from the women's groups? After all, they were integral in bringing peace both in Northern Ireland and Liberia.
I'd say to the Noble Lady, it's very important we hear from everybody, and one of the things I do with the responsibilities of the aid and development portfolio that is now squarely within the Foreign Office is make sure that we listen to all of the NGOs, all of the experts, and all of those people that can make a difference when it comes to getting aid in and trying to relieve this desperate humanitarian situation.
The Foreign Secretary, that when he said, and I quote, "I'm worried that Israel has taken action that might be in breach of international law."
Hear, hear.
Did he have in mind the principle of proportionality in armed conflict and whether it is a proportionate self-defence by Israel to have been responsible so far for some 24,000 Palestinian deaths, including 10,000 children?
Hear, 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 hear.
What I meant when I said that was simply that I worry about these things. It's my job to worry. The Foreign Office has a job which is to look at the legal advice and to work out whether Israel is committed and capable of complying with international humanitarian law, and then based on that judgment we have to take a series of actions, including looking at things like export licenses. So we always urge Israel to obey international humanitarian law, and it's very important that we do so.
But is it not the case that there would be an immediate ceasefire tomorrow? An immediate ceasefire tomorrow if Hamas were to release the hostages, if Hamas were to release the hostages, lay down their weapons, and the criminals that did atrocities on October the 7th were to go and join their leaders in luxury hotels in the Gulf?
Well, I think that Noble Lord makes a very good point, which is, of course, Hamas could end this tomorrow by saying that they were going to lay down their weapons or leave. Look, what we have said, of course, everyone's aware that we want a sustainable ceasefire. That means Hamas not in power, not able to launch rockets and terror. And we've said we want to see this immediate pause so we can get aid in and hostages out. But in many ways, the very best outcome would be to see that immediate pause for the aid and the hostages, and to see if you could then convert that into a sustainable ceasefire without there being further hostilities. But we have to be clear, for that to happen, a series of things would have to happen. There'd have to be immediate negotiations to release all the hostages. You'd have the Hamas leadership having to leave Gaza. You'd have to be clear that there were no more danger of rocket and terror attacks on Israel. You'd have to put together something based on the Palestinian Authority, backed by other Palestinians, to go back into Gaza. That in many ways would be the best outcome. But if you call now for an immediate ceasefire with no further fighting, when you've got Hamas still in power, still launching rockets, still capable of terror attacks, not only would you not have a sustainable ceasefire and a sustainable peace, you would have no hope of the thing that I think many in this House would like to see, which is a two-state solution.
Yeah. Third question, Lord Collins of Highbury.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the UK was instrumental in developing the Sustainable Development Goals. Following the global recommitment to the SDGs at the United Nations General Assembly last autumn, we recognised the opportunity to reinvigorate a sense of collective purpose and partnership to deliver those goals. The International Development White Paper sets out a re-energised agenda for the UK working with partners to accelerate progress on the SDGs by 2030. We will champion the SDGs throughout the key summits and moments this year, and I'll be making a speech on the SDGs in Davos tomorrow.
I very much welcome that last comment. And of course, a barrier to progress is actually debt. And of course, the average low-income country now spends 2.3 times more on servicing debt than on social assistance. And at the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, the Noble Lord actually stressed the importance of cross-Whitehall working to address priority areas. Debt is one of those areas. Now, of course, one of the mechanisms that the UN adopted for monitoring progress on the SDGs is voluntary national reviews. We had ours, last one, only one, in 2019. Spain due to publish their third. Argentina, they're fourth. What are we doing? Can the noble lord give an explanation why we haven't followed their example and used the voluntary national reviews?
Well, first of all, let me just say how much I agree with the noble lord about the importance of the position about debt and what needs to be done to help countries relieve their debts. I don't necessarily think the answer is always to cancel debt, because in many cases that affects a country's credit rating. But we do support things like climate resilient debt clauses and the flexibility they give. In terms of voluntary national reviews, as he knows, we had one in 2019. We haven't made a decision about the follow-up. But I would say to him, look, it's not really Britain that is the problem in meeting the SDGs. What's happened here is because of COVID and also because of Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, African countries have had a triple whammy. They've had the whammy of COVID, they've had the whammy of higher fuel prices, and the whammy of higher food prices. That has caused an increase in poverty, set the SDGs off track, and what we've got to do is energise the world, the voluntary sector, and crucially the private sector, to invest in the future of the SDGs and to get us back on track.
Instead of going on with slogans like "Stop the Boats" and gimmicks like deportation to Rwanda, isn't the best way to help to reduce illegal migration to see increased assistance to these countries, to make it possible for the people who have to migrate, who are forced to leave their countries, to live there in peace and prosperity?
Well, I certainly half agree with the noble lord, which is the investment we can put into countries from which the migrants are coming is absolutely essential. We've got to make sure that countries in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are building a future for their own people, providing jobs. Otherwise, those people are going to go on the move. I mean, the figures are outstanding. I mean, if you think about it, in 1950, I think the population of Europe was twice that of Africa. By the end of this century, the population of Africa will be 4 times that of Europe. So making sure those countries develop is absolutely crucial. But at the same time, when you do have problems of widespread illegal immigration, it is important to stop the boats.
My Lords, would the noble Lord the Minister not take another look at this issue of debt forgiveness, which he spoke rather critically of just now? In previous iterations of this saga, we've been brought in the end to recognise that debt forgiveness was necessary for some of the poorest countries. Could he not look at that again and also think of whether we couldn't link that with the commitment by a country that was forgiven its debt to do more on climate change?
No, well, I very much respect the noble lord and what he says. And of course, we've been leaders on this through the Paris Club and through the other mechanisms. And in many cases, it's been the right thing to do is to write down a country's debt. And as he says, with respect to climate change, these climate resilient debt clauses can make a great difference in helping these countries. And fundamentally, if we want to achieve the SDGs, we need to motivate global finance. And one of the ways we can do that is through the multilateral development banks, because if they expand their balance sheets, there's probably an extra £400 billion of money that they can invest to help these countries with their growth.
My Lords, the Foreign Secretary has said that he thinks that the merger of the DFID and the Foreign Office and the cuts in aid were now justified. That was not what he said at the time. How much does he regret that his successors have trashed his proud legacy? And more to the point, how assured can he be that the funding for Africa, which is still being cut even if it's promised an increase, will actually not be diverted to the Home Office as has happened in the last 2 years?
Yeah. Well, that isn't exactly what I said. I would say to the noble lord, I'm very proud of the fact we reached 0.7%. I had some disagreements with this government before I joined it, but politics is a team enterprise. When you decide to join a government, you accept cabinet collective responsibility, you accept you're going to work with that team with the policies they have. But I'm proud of the fact that with 0.5% and a growing economy, we're seeing more money go into overseas development. And obviously now that the refugee crisis is abating, we're actually seeing, I mentioned Africa, we're going to see something like an increase from 600 million to over 1.2 billion in terms of our budgets. And also we are committed, when the fiscal rules allow, to get back to the 0.7% that we historically achieved.
My Lords, the biggest threat to the SDGs in Africa is conflict, internal instability. And in the Sahel, that has been increased ever since the disastrous Libyan incursion, which he will remember very well. So what steps does he personally intend to take in order to enhance security and democracy in sub-Saharan Africa? And will that include aid to civil society organizations?
I think the Noble Lord is quite right that if you look at the SDGs and poverty more generally, half of the poorest people in the world are now in fragile states. So if we can't help fix fragile and conflict-affected states, we're not going to meet the SDGs. What I would say to him is that if you look across the Sahel, there have been a number of coups, there have been a number of wars, there's been a lot of instability. I don't think there's a single answer to this, but one of the issues is that when we look at aid and development and how we help these countries, making sure that they have adequate security is essential. Often in this house or in the other place we say defence is the first duty of government, but when actually it comes to aid, we set up a whole series of different things that we think countries ought to achieve, and we have to help them with their fundamental and basic security, and that's something we're committed to doing.
My Lords.
Some 60% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa are smallholder farmers, with most of these being women. And food from domestic resources is crucial for reaching many of these SDG goals. Poverty, hunger, health, the management of water, and even education, because these lady farmers put nearly every penny they make from their food production into educating their children. So would the Noble Lord please undertake, and I ask as one Lord Cameron to another, to boost the currently very small team in his department involved in agriculture, to enable them to help these lady farmers to feed their families and their nations and resolve many of these sustainable development goals.
I will certainly take away what he says and look at it carefully. I think that in history, though, it's true that a green revolution of productivity in agriculture has almost always been necessary to see more of an industrial revolution and an increase in prosperity. But he makes a good point about small farmers, and as we should keep it in the family, I better go and have a careful look at it.
My Lords, Sustainable Development Goals included this time volunteering. He, as a Prime Minister, really supported volunteering and introduced the International Citizen Service, which was run by VSO in this country incredibly successfully, so that the African Union then took it up as a major way of engaging those millions and millions of young people that he talked about in Africa. But we have had now a generation of young people in this country and indeed around the countries that organisations like VSO work in, who've missed out. Can he assure me that volunteering will now take a central part in the government's strategy to re-energise achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and really do something to enable young people here and in Africa and around the developing world to get the skills and leadership that they need?
I think one of the great strengths of the SDGs was they were much more comprehensive than the Millennium Development Goals that they replaced. In fact, I was helped to chair the panel that actually set them up, and we were determined we were going to involve the private sector, we were going to bring together economic growth and climate, we were going to have much more to say about gender, and as she rightly says, make sure things like volunteering are included. I'm glad she mentions International Citizen Service. I was very proud to establish it as Prime Minister, and my Development Secretary was Andrew Mitchell, and she will notice that Andrew Mitchell and I are now back in the same department, and we hope to make some progress on this issue.
Fourth question, Baroness Chakrabarty.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, an open and stable international order is in our interest. We use it to deliver on issues of domestic and global importance, such as the Bletchley AI Safety Declaration. We invest in it as the fifth largest UN budget contributor. We support reform of it to ensure it benefits everyone, and we hold to account those who undermine it, including through steadfast support to Ukraine, sanctions against Russia, and ensuring maritime security in the Red Sea. I would say that in a dangerous and uncertain world, this stable international order is more essential than ever.
I'm grateful to the Noble Lord the Foreign Secretary for the clarity of that answer on the importance and scale of his task. I wonder whether that task was helped or hindered by two developments yesterday. The first was fresh advice from the UN High Commissioner on Refugees that the Rwanda scheme, now updated by the Rwanda Treaty and the Safety of Rwanda Bill, is still contrary to international law. And the second development, comments by the Prime Minister on, I think, GB News, that the Court of Human Rights is a, quote, foreign, end quote, court, and that he is prepared to defy it.
What I would say to the noble lady is, first of all, that we do not believe the Rwanda scheme is contrary to international law. How I would characterise it is to say that, look, the things like the Refugee Convention were written for another age, written for an age when there wasn't mass international travel, when there wasn't the ubiquity of mobile phones. And what we are saying is, yes, this is out-of-the-box thinking, yes, it's quite unorthodox, but you've got a choice, frankly, when you've got people arriving from a perfectly safe country to another safe country, you have to deal with that trade. And that does require some fresh thinking. Now, it's not possible to put people straight back in a boat and take them back to France. That isn't possible, so that is why the Rwanda scheme is being introduced. It is within the law, it is novel, but I believe it can work.
My Lords, as many people do feel that the whole international rule of law actually is collapsing before our eyes, and as my noble friend has rightly just remarked just now, that this is a very dangerous and fragile situation internationally, would you agree that in fact it's only going to be coped with by new international organisations and institutions, or brushing up the present set of institutions we have? And can you just share some thoughts with us on where the priorities should be in that process? Should we concentrate on repairing the United Nations, which is in a mess, or inventing new structures on that side, as Lord Owen was suggesting just now? Or does he think that the Commonwealth network, which is far the largest network of voluntary, like-minded nations in the world, might have an important role in building up a future structure to deal with all these crises?
Look, I think it's an excellent question and difficult to answer, but fundamentally what we should do, we are in almost all of these networks. We're in the G7, the G20, the OECD, we're in the UN, its fifth biggest contributor, a permanent member of the Security Council. I think what we should do is be quite thoughtful and selective about where we think institutions can be strengthened. I would give a good example of that being NATO. It's undoubtedly stronger than it was 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years ago, and that's a very good thing. I think there are some organisations where you could spend the rest of your political life trying to reform them, and you might struggle to make progress, and I think I might put the United Nations in that category. We should use what we have and make it work as well as we can. We should look at new institutions when there's a specific problem. I would point to things like the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, Gavi, as a new institution that does amazing work that we should get behind. So I'm a practical conservative. I don't have a all-encompassing global set of rules that we have to abide by. Let's take what we have and where we can improve it.
My Lords,
the noble lord has been engaged in terms of the United Nations, is the enlargement of the Security Council. Can he update us on the progress of that, including on the system of pen holders? Also, when nations fail to protect the most important task of protecting the safety and security of their people, it's often civil society that's first to come to their defence. And Guterres in the UN has encouraged the involvement of civil society at the Security Council. What does the noble lord think about that? And will he do more to support the Secretary-General in engaging with civil society?
Well, I'm certainly a supporter of engaging civil society at the United Nations Security Council, and that's something that we have been doing. And I'll look very carefully at what Secretary-General Guterres has said. We do support United Nations Security Council reform. We do think that India should be a permanent member of the Security Council. We do think you need to look at the representation of Africa. But I would say candidly that when you're trying to make progress on these reforms, this is going to be a very difficult one to get unanimity for. And in terms of my priorities, I think in this very difficult, dangerous, disputatious world that we have at the moment, the most important thing is to ask ourselves the question, what can we do to strengthen our networks? What do we do to strengthen NATO? What do we do to strengthen our own defences and our security and intelligence forces to keep us safe at home? What are the institutions where we can get things done through? Although I support United Nations Security Council reform, I think it might be some time in coming.
My Lords, going back to the Noble Lord's answers to the Noble Lady Baroness Chakrabarti, I think the Foreign Secretary said that Rwanda is a perfectly safe country. If that is the case, why do we still grant asylum to people coming from Rwanda? And secondly, he suggested that international refugee law is rather out of date, implying that if a law is out of date, if it comes from a different age, it could be ignored. Is that really the inference he wanted to leave with the House?
No, what I'm saying is that in the modern world, where you have the ubiquity of mobile phones, where you have mass cheap travel, countries have to make a decision about how to deal with illegal migration. And I would just be very frank with the Noble Lady and say, look, I don't think we can tolerate a situation where you've got very wide scale, very visible, illegal migration taking place in small boats. I think it's not only desperately dangerous for the people that do it, and another 4 people lost their lives in the freezing cold waters of the English Channel the other night. It's not only unsafe for them, it completely undermines faith in our immigration system. And as I say, all these people are coming from a totally safe country, France. Now, you've got a choice in politics. You can either say, and I don't want to get too political because I know that's not the way of this House. You can either say we're going to work on dealing with the criminal gangs and we're going to work on more agreements with France. I agree with all those things. But ultimately, if you do not take the people who come in the boats and say you can't stay here because you come illegally, you're not going to stop this trade. You're not going to save those lives. This government has made a choice. That is what we're going to do. Yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, in the case of Rwanda, it's out-of-the-box thinking. But it's the right thing to do, because if you don't do it, you'll carry on with the problem. And that's not just Britain that has this issue. You had 6 million people cross the southern border in the United States. You've got country after country in Europe looking at novel thinking for how you deal with illegal immigration. And what I would say to colleagues in this House is that we've got to do that, because otherwise we're going to have a system which will have no public confidence.
My Lords, one of the best ways the UK could stand up for a rules-based international order would be to do all we can to secure the release of Vladimir Kara-Murza, the British citizen incarcerated on trumped-up charges by Putin. So will the Noble Lord the Foreign Secretary agree to an urgent meeting with me, his wife Evgenia Kara-Murza, and those who are campaigning for his release?
I think I'm right in saying that a meeting has already been arranged and is in process. I don't know whether the Noble Lord will be joining us, but it would be a pleasure to get together after all these years.
My Lord, in furtherance of a rule-based society, could I suggest to my noble friend that it would be desirable if he could promote a coalition of willing states to reinforce the efforts of the United States and the United Kingdom to ensure safe navigation in international seas? What we need is a coalition of willing nations to participate.
Well, obviously no one likes a coalition more than I do. But I would say to the Noble Lord, that we do have a coalition in terms of those countries that are not only taking part in Operation Prosperity Guardian in the Red Sea, but also all those countries that are supporting it. And again, even when it came to the military action, there was a coalition of countries, including the Dutch, Canada, Australia, that were backing us militarily, and then a wider coalition of countries supporting the action taken. So wherever possible, we should build a coalition, but sometimes it is necessary to act and to act quickly, and I think the Prime Minister made the right decision.
My Lords, but how does a rules-based international order sit with the destruction of the Sino-British Treaty, an international treaty which has led to the dismantling of democracy and the dismantling of 2 systems, 1 country in Hong Kong? How does it sit alongside the show trials of Jimmy Lai, a British citizen, and also the naming in those proceedings of 4 other British citizens, including our former Consul General, Andrew Hine. Surely that in turn is a breach of the Geneva Convention. And why hasn't the Noble Lord's government done anything yet to use Magnitsky sanctions against any of those who have been responsible for these things?
Well, I think one of the reasons for supporting a rules-based order is that it enables you to call out other countries when they fail to live up to it. And that's exactly what we've done in the case that he refers to. And that is why we've said that the national security law needs to be taken out. That is why we said that Jimmy Lai needs to be released. And we've been very clear about that and how we don't think that it's in line with the arrangements that were put in place when the Hong Kong Agreement was reached.
My Lords, that concludes Secretary of State's questions for today. Shall we take a moment just to clear the benches?